So this presentation is useful to have a slide about kind of key terms and concepts, because this isn't a presentation about data, because our project's only recently started. It's about theory and practice. So we want to make sure that our ideas are clear and simple and easy to follow. So obviously we've been talking about double empathy, which today we've been looking at mostly in terms of interpersonal situations. So the difference, what happens when you have people with different dispositions and the difficulties in understanding and empathy that can occur. But for us, we're actually looking at it in a wider context. So double empathy as a phenomenon between institutions and communities. So we're looking at double empathy here in terms of a societal level, but obviously we have seen some really wonderful research, empirical research in support of that today. When we're talking about research institutions, we typically mean universities, although there are other types of institution out there. And Matthews Hub is specifically the charity that we're collaborating with on this project. So Matthews Hub is a charity that supports autistic adults, and it's based in Hull, East Yorkshire. And today we're going to talk about our project called Research Sandbox, which has the aim to collaborate with autistic people to try and reimagine what this research process could look like. Sandbox is a term that's used in coding circles to describe an environment in which people can explore and test ideas freely. So that's where that term came from. And the idea came from my doctoral research with Matthews Hub, where I spent a significant period of time sort of learning and understanding the differences, the everyday challenges that members of Matthews Hub had, and the way in which there seemed to be this big power asymmetry or difference between the priorities of research and the everyday needs of members, and in particular the fact that autistic voice was there but not being listened to. So thinking about how we can improve listening processes. This project falls under the category of participatory research. It's important to note that there are many versions of participatory research. It's quite a large umbrella term to describe many different practices. So we're planning to just tell the story of the ideas we've developed with the intention of trying to cultivate a deeper research relationship that's mutually transformative and views people as expert collaborators, not just participants. So this is a version of participatory research known as emancipatory research, which is framed around specifically themes of social justice. And finally, this isn't a presentation about solutions. As I said before, we've only just started the project, so we're on a journey of discovery and dialogue, and in many places you'll see us actually present questions rather than answers. And we're using these questions to help guide us in our process. So I've also created a conceptual map of this presentation, just to help people understand how things are linked together. So as I said at the start, we'll be looking as our starting point at double empathy theory and thinking about how this can guide our research practice in the specific context of our Research Sandbox project. And there are many, many things that we would love to talk to you about today, but we can't fit them all in. So we're going to pick just 3 things to talk about. So the first is power, which I'll be talking about. The second is immersion in the research field, which Catherine will be talking about. And the third is creative methods, which Sammy will be talking about. Okay, so on to power. So I'll start here with a quote from Damien. Quote says that autism studies involve competing contradictory discourses. The voice and assertion of autistic people themselves are often traditionally the least listened to. So this quote highlights that there are significant power issues within the research on autism. Specifically, there is a long, deep and troubled history of very problematic research that has excluded, stigmatized and marginalized autistic voice. And this is a context we can't escape from, and consequently and understandably trust in research is very low. So this brings into focus the really pressing need we have, whatever research you're doing, to think critically about that power relationship. And more specifically, within that relationship, what can be done to empower autistic people throughout that process. Where these issues of power meet the double empathy is, as Damien was saying this morning, when he was talking about Harry Collins and interactional expertise, the social context for knowledge being produced really matters. So there are different forms of knowledge and expertise out there, but their recognition and development are socially situated. So what that means is that it's through social interactions that knowledge is established or legitimized. And that's where we see the pressure being put on that double empathy barrier. So the kind of questions we have been asking ourselves is whose expertise is being valued and listened to. This is something that builds on a commentary I wrote with Alex Gillespie in 2019 about how researchers in general should improve their listening to autistic voice instead of sort of reinventing the same things that autistic people have been saying for many years. Within this, though, it's also important to avoid the characterization of researchers as being seen as non-autistic. There are many great autistic academics, and we're hoping for this project to lay the seeds of building more ultimately, but also for people that are neurodivergent within the research process, it's still possible for them to make errors or assumptions about autistic people. So it really is about maintaining an ongoing critical stance about ourselves and how knowledge and expertise are recognized in the research process. Now, within that research relationship, there are many forms of power. Again, there are too many to talk about in this presentation, but we're going to talk about just 4 of them that have come up in our dialogue with Matthews Hub so far. So the first one is about who owns the knowledge. So this is a really prevalent issue in participatory research in general. And it's important that researchers reflect on differences in power and recognize that certain types of knowledge are always implicitly or explicitly privileged. And there have also been many criticisms of the way that researchers have been very opportunist in the past, winning trust to get data and then sort of leaving and publishing the results. And obviously that helps their career. But what about the participants that they're studying? So this was a really good topic of discussion, and we talked about how we would like to aim for the possibility that all collaborators could be co-authors in our project. This has ethical implications for things like anonymity, and consequently there are additional processes of information and consent as to understanding what the implications of co-authorship are, what they entail. And these are things that we have developed through having a more dialogic relationship with our ethics review panel, rather than a sort of one-hit ethics application, that's it, and then you go and do what you do. Rather, we've set up a relationship with our ethics panel that we're in constant dialogue to talk about things as the project organically grows. The next power aspect is who directs the decision-making. So decision-making can happen at several levels within a project, and it can happen over multiple time points. As I said before, the development for the ideas of this project initially came from dialogue with Matthews Hub in the first place. But again, there's the challenge of trying to make sure that people have the choice to be involved in the decision-making if they want to be involved in the decision-making. So the way we've set it up is that participants have a choice about what level of involvement they have in the project, from taking part in online discussions to being full collaborators within the project, and being part of the process of analysis and directing the goal setting of the project as well. So each level of involvement has clear expectations and responsibilities, but there's the flexibility to move between those levels so that collaborators can find the right role for them, which might not be apparent at the start, but there's a flexibility to move around and explore. So this does also raise challenges around things like how do you manage differences of opinion or points of tension within the project? How are they addressed? At the same time, we have taken the approach that we don't feel that it is necessary to always have consensus. It's okay if there are differences of opinion, and that these should be reported as part of the write-up if there are those differences. So again, we have a more open approach to that. Also, what's bidirectionally shared? So this really is key to double empathy. So a large part of the power asymmetry is that the researcher often takes something that's very personal to participant, and then they leave. And so it's not really, you can't really have a relationship of any kind of equity if one person is just taken from the other. So we spoke about what is shared in this relationship to try and overcome this double empathy barrier. So we discussed the idea that, vouchers and money, these are actually more like forms of compensation for people's time, and they're not really equivalent to a meaningful exchange of what the participant gives up in a true sense of the word, in terms of equivalence. So we've been thinking about how we can approach that relationship differently, about what's shared in that relationship. So for us, we're going to be delivering workshops about skills-based research approaches. And the idea of doing this is that it provides some more sustainable skills for the people we're collaborating with, whether that's something that they're able to put on their CV and transfer to another setting, whether it's being able to take a more active role within the research project itself, or if they might want to be interested in becoming a researcher further down the line, then this could be really helpful for them as well. And at York St John, we have a foundation degree, which could be a potential avenue in the future for potentially creating that pathway back into academia and research, which would be really wonderful. We can make that happen. So again, the key thing here is about choice, so that participants can basically choose what's shared in the relationship according to what they would like. It's also, in terms of bidirectionality, we're also planning to researchers at York St John. So there are a number of different research organisations and research groups at York St John, and we'd like to understand if we're developing these relationships with Matthews Hub or other groups, how we actually make that pathway more sustainable by plugging into what's going on and the way in which researchers are operating. So we're actually researching our own institution as well. And finally, the terms language and power are very, very closely linked. So there's a real need to ensure that language is clear and accessible. So there are many potential dangers with using unfamiliar terms or scientific jargon or discriminatory terms or incorrect identity markers. One of the things we've decided on very early is that we felt the term participants wasn't really the right term for us in this project, because it felt a bit too passive and didn't recognize the expertise of the autistic person. So we've aimed for the term collaborators. We also plan to create resources around the project that will be freely accessible at the end. And in the process of doing that, we'll be drawing on all knowledge about accessible design for autistic people as well. Okay, so that sort of gives you a really brief overview of the different types of questions we've been orientating around. In terms of power, I'll pass over to Catherine now, who will talk about immersion within the research field.
Thanks, Brett. So as Brett said, I'm going to talk a bit more about one of the ways that we're hoping to address issues involving power, and that's through immersion within the research field. So we've started with this quote from Damien, which says, gaining expertise in what it is to be autistic would take immersion in the culture and practices of autistic people. Yet it is questionable as to what extent such immersion is possible for non-autistic people. And it's certainly doubtful that many established scientists have made the effort. And there's a lot of aspects and depths to this quote that unfortunately don't have time to do justice to in this presentation, but we wanted to specifically pick up on the idea of immersion in further detail, as this has been a key part of what we have planned for this project moving forwards. So what is immersion? Well, at its core, immersion is the practice of spending time within the field of study. The amount of time spent, the use of the time, and the level of immersion can vary widely between studies and disciplines. And when we initially started to read literature around immersion, we struggled to find many examples of immersive practice within the field of psychological sciences. So instead, we turned to different disciplines for examples, including anthropology. And some objectives of immersion within this field included for the researcher to develop a richer understanding of the culture, the language, the relationships, and the people in the population being studied. To gain a wider understanding of explicit research and service priorities of everyone involved within research, rather than just priorities set by the research team, so that we can better tailor research and services. so that we can better understand the environment in which the research will be taking place, including organisational structures, existing hierarchies and routines within the environment. And in some cases, in some studies, the immersive period is a form of analysis, where researchers explore and analyse the existing organised routines of behaviour. So that's sort of a general overview of immersion. Why is immersion important to us within the context of this project? Well, as Brett spoke about earlier, overcoming double empathy barriers requires a two-way exchange of communication, ideas, and resources. And it also requires a critical stance on being open to change as researchers. So the first thing I said is really important is that bi-directional understanding and two-way transformation. We want to develop a culture of familiarity and trust where everyone feels open to discuss and share ideas. And this was a key component of Brett's doctoral thesis, which had a significant period of immersion that ended up actually changing the course of his research. And familiarity and trust was really key to building those research relationships. We recognise that everybody has different experiences, interests and expertise, and we're keen to facilitate an environment where these can be shared organically. And in a similar vein, we are keen to develop an atmosphere built on mutual understanding, where everyone feels comfortable to share as many or as few ideas as they want to. And then specifically in the context of Matthews Hub, how we're translating those immersive goals. Well, despite only being allocated funding for a short 5-month period for this project, we've allocated a significant portion of time to this period of immersion because we think it's a really key part of our process. And during this period, we'll be spending time within Matthews Hub, taking part in activities and interacting with group members. There'll be no data collection and no documentation during this period, just to really ensure that everybody feels comfortable and relationships can be developed organically. It's really important for us to have continual iterative reflection as researchers, both individually and in a group, about our attitudes, our existing knowledge and understanding, our identity, both individually and as part of the group, and relationships. And this kind of allows us to mitigate the potential danger of internalised ableism. We'll be volunteering to help with Matthews Hub operations where needed and where wanted, according to our conversations with Matthews Hub. And we're planning to organically grow our activities. So it's important to respond to the needs and wishes of Matthews Hub staff and members. And as such, we're initially intending to attend a small number of open invite social evenings, and then to review this as time passes through ongoing conversations with Matthews Hub about our presence. And then, so existing literature on periods of immersion has highlighted some key considerations for immersion within a group setting. And as Brett has already said, this isn't a presentation about solutions, and we're in the initial stages of this project. So a lot of these things are ongoing considerations and questions at this point, but really important for us to keep ourselves aware of. So some key considerations for us at this stage of the project are thinking about how we can ensure that our research and our relationships developed are sustainable, such that collaboration is maintained and relationships developed, and the research is an ongoing process like Brett's already talked about. We want to think about how we can develop effective relationships and truly immerse ourselves within Matthews Hub, within the context of our existing relationships with Matthews Hub, whilst also considering everybody's personal boundaries. And then finally, immersion is not always seen as a priority in the eyes of funding bodies currently. So we need to think about how we can manage the need and the importance of immersion with the constraints that are there on funding and on time. So that's a brief overview of immersion. I'll hand over to Sammy to talk a bit more about creative methodologies.
Hi, I'm Sammy Williams. I'll be speaking about the last topic, which is creative methods in data collection. I do apologise, I'm having a few internet problems, but I think it's working now. So yeah, so we're starting off with a quote from
I'll jump in if Sammy's internet problems have become a lot more real, I think.
Yes, I think she's...
Oh no, it's just, I'm really looking forward to hearing Sammy. Okay, I'll read this quote for Sammy. Hopefully, she's just moved house, and yeah, it's a stressful time for her. So I'll read this quote, and then hopefully she can be back to talk about the next bit. So this is a quote from Susie Rideout.
Interest.
Oh, you're back, Sammy.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. When did I leave?
Just as you were about to read the quote, we lost you.
Well, I read out the quote. Well, I read out the quote and just said that it's highlighting why creative methods are so important to give a voice to participants who otherwise might not be able to participate and have their voices heard. So yeah, and I sorry about that. I just moved on. I've just moved house and we're having some teething problems. But I was just saying, one of the key factors we're looking at in terms of creative methods is interest-based approach. So to methodology. So most traditional methods, specifically in qualitative research, are socially based. So, for example, interviews and focus groups. However, that can often be exclusionary for a lot of neurodivergent and specifically autistic people. So we're looking at the question of what about interest-based methods? So integrating activities that autistic people already enjoy and building off monotropic skills. So, for example, linking into research by Dinah Murray on monotropism, which really highlighted why it should be recognised that the intense interests in monotropism that neurodivergent and autistic people experience can be seen as a strength rather than just a difference or a drawback. So looking also as what similar to what Catherine said with regards to immersion, a lot of research we found when we looked using innovating in interest-based methodology were in other subject areas. So for example, human geography and anthropology. So looking at one study from the area of human geography, Trell and Van Hoven found that combining creative methods with traditional methods. So for example, in their study, they combine methods such as engaging in walks, mental mapping and photography with traditional methods such as interviews. And they found this added a lot of value to the data they collected, and also allowed different individuals to participate in research who otherwise wouldn't have been able to, going back to the quote from Rideout that we started with. So looking at why interest-based methods matter. So myself, when carrying out research for my master's degree, I looked at the experience of autistic adults when engaged with narrative media. And because I was interviewing these people about subjects they were already interested in, it provided a lot of rich data. These people were passionate about what they were talking about and were more open to speak about these subjects. So looking at other examples of interest-based methods, Melissa Chappell, who just spoke, looked at reading activity and integrating this, and found that it led to more nuanced emotional responses from both autistic and non-autistic participants, showing that this interest-based methods, it can lead to gains not just when looking at participatory research or research into neurodiversity, but research into allistic participants as well. And then research by Heisman and Gillespie also showed that when pursuing activities of interest between them, it led to an increase in creativity between autistic people, and this just led to richer data and just more data that could be collected. And it's just a quick overview of why we're interested in looking at these methodologies for our own study. And we just have a quick potential directions for where we're going to take these ideas with our own studies. So thinking about possible uses for these methods. So I'm a member myself of Matthews Hub, and so I've thought about the current interests and groups that are already set up there. So I know that there's already a walking club existing at the Hub, meaning a possible opportunity for similar walking data collection methods to Trell and Van Hoven. There's also a lot of groups that that include more creative activities, and these are very popular at the Hub. So it means things like storytelling, dance, mind mapping, art activities might be preferred by some members. And another popular group at the Hub involves tabletop RPGs, specifically Dungeons and Dragons. So, and I'm personally quite experienced with that. So it suggests things like improvisation, role play and role-playing games, and just gaming in general as other potential activities we could draw on for data collection. Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks, Sammy. And so that brings us to the end of our presentation, and we want to just conclude by saying a big thank you to Matthews Hub and its members, also to our funder, the Institute of Social Justice at York St John, and our research group, our Research on Neurodiversity, Wellbeing and Counselling research group. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you all. It's been quite an eye-opener, this talk.